everybody. This is Donna Knapp. Welcome to ITSM Academy. I'll be your host for today's webinar. So I have to say I have a special place in my heart for folks like Vicki Rogers, because our speaker today, because she has, I believe, one of the most thankless jobs in IT, and some of you I'm sure will agree with me. Vicki is the Senior Manager of Change at Georgia Tech, and she's going to talk about change management with us today. So Vicki has over 20 years of IT experience and has been involved in not only service management and change management, but leadership development and diversity in IT. She does a lot of great work with helping women in IT. She has a BBA in business management, an MBA, and an EDS in learning leadership and organizational development. And we all know that service management in general is all about organizational change. And so that empathy and that understanding of what it takes to help people embrace, especially practices like change enablement, is so important. And she regularly speaks on those topics, and again, particularly around topics related to things like women leaders in higher education. Outside work, and she'll share some lovely pictures. She's the mom to two brilliant and successful college girls and one very spoiled schnauzer, and all of us who love our pets can certainly appreciate Vicki's perspective on that. So Vicki is going to talk about how they implemented what was change management when they first got started at Georgia Tech, and you know, a little bit about their evolution as they went along. I'm going to collect your questions in the background, so if you have questions, please feel free to chat them in, and we'll do a little Q&A session at the end. So, hey, Vicki, welcome.
Hey, good morning. Thank you so much. I think we're still morning across the way.
Well,
can you guys hear me okay?
We can hear you great, and thank you so much for joining us, and our audience is all yours.
Great. So let me first commend you all for wanting to talk about change management. Nobody wants to talk about change management. I know that going in. And I do want to confess up front that I struggle a little bit with webinars. I like people. I like to see your facial expressions and hear your comments and hear you laugh and things like that. So bear with me as I try this method of training and discussing things with you. So I want to tell you today about change management at Georgia Tech and how we adopted that change about a year ago. And we'll spend some time talking about how it's worked and what's worked and what hadn't, and definitely want to hear your questions at the end. So because I like to connect with people, I like to start out and tell you a little bit about me. I do have 20 years, actually it's more like 25 now, years experience. I am very Southern, so I'm sure you hear the drawl. Spent most of my life in the Southeast. I've worked corporate, I've worked higher ed, I worked corporate again, and I'm back to higher ed. And I feel like I have this really great just depth of experience in and out of those two worlds. And if you've worked one or the other, you know that the transition is difficult. So I've kind of spent my career playing on that a little bit and served in a lot of different roles. I do have a heart for diversity in IT and women in IT. So I encourage you to reach out to me if you're interested in those topics as well. Okay, so you're looking at my family. My girls, my oldest is at the University of Georgia, which is the other school in Georgia. My youngest is at West Georgia, and they are just wonderful in every way, as I'm sure you know. But my favorite child is in the bottom left. That's Belle. She's definitely the favorite. And I like to include that picture in the bottom right of me and my husband when I was a senior in high school, because that's when I was skinny. So it just makes me feel good. I'm pretending I can hear you laugh right now. All right. So tell you a little bit about Georgia Tech. We are a public research institute in Georgia. We have about 33,000 students. We're about 2/3 male, 1/3 female, because we are an engineering school. But that's changing. We're making the transition. About a quarter of our students are international students. We confer about 7,000 degrees a year, and we're part of the 26 institution university system of Georgia, We employ about 17,000 people at Georgia Tech, and we do not want to be confused with the University of Georgia, who's our biggest sports rival. I have a Georgia degree, FYI. Makes me a little unpopular around here. But then, the change person needs to be a little unpopular. So fun facts, the Yellow Jackets are our mascot. Our first class had only 84 male students. Women weren't admitted until the 50s. We were the first college in the Deep South to allow African American students without a court order. So we're proud of that diversity, history and background. Bobby Dodd was our coach, and just little, trivia fact, only 4 people have the distinction of being elected to the College Football Hall of Fame as both a player and a coach, and Bobby Dodd's one of them. And you all know about the Heisman Trophy. The Heisman was named for John Heisman, who coached just about every sport here at Georgia Tech at one time or the other. So let's get more into the basics of our IT organization. We have what's called distributed IT. It means that in the corporate world, you have like a home office IT, and then you have different divisions have their own IT units. In higher ed, it means that we have a centralized IT department with about 350 employees. And then each of our schools, so for example, the School of Engineering and the College of Science, each of those individual units have their own little IT group as well. So it presents an interesting challenge, and especially in the change management realm, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. We have lots of legacy systems and lots of institutional knowledge. Georgia Tech does sit in the heart of downtown, and just to make you a little jealous, the IT department at Georgia Tech got to move into this brand new building right in the heart of Midtown, and that's the picture of it in the top in the bottom left. And I don't know about you as IT employees, but I've spent a lot of time in basements and closets and dark rooms. And so for us to get this beautiful new building was a big deal. It tells you about the commitment Georgia Tech has to IT and our importance within the institute. Fun fact, if you ever get to Atlanta, in our building is the largest spiral staircase in the world. It's 22 stories of spiral staircase. If you don't like heights, you don't want to look up or down. But if you're in the Atlanta area, I encourage you to stop in. It's a beautiful building. It's a lot of fun. All right, today we are going to talk about why we implemented change management, and I'll talk about it as we go on. But it was change management when we implemented in 2018. We'll talk about how it works, things we learned, talk a little bit about reporting, and does it matter? What's in it for me, and are we happy with the results? It's been a fun journey, and I'm excited to get to tell you about that. So I'm sure you're all familiar with ITIL. This is just a picture of ITIL version 3, and keep in mind that version 3 is where we implemented at the beginning of 2018 into 2017. So I want to give a nod to version 3 and where change management sits within service transition in that wheel that we looked at in version 3. Now, you all know, I'm sure, because you're here with the ITSM Academy, that we've transitioned to ITIL 4, which was released last year, and there were some changes to change. Now we are change enablement instead of change management. There was a brief time period where we were change control, but now we moved to change enablement. I like that language. There's a lot of debate and a lot of conversation about it, but I like it. We're moving from a place of process to a place of real practice, moving from life cycle to true value change, kind of changing the ideas around authority and the concept to change authority, and definitely considering continuous integration and automation. So just be aware that some of these concepts and ideas that I'll talk about were from the previous version, and part of our continuous improvement is to mature and grow in that space. I've included the links because you can download this presentation. I've included the links to Joe the IT Guy's blog, which is the one that I look at a lot, and then to Greg Sanker's work on IT change management. He's kind of in my mind, he's the God of the change there. So give them a look. There's links to both of their sites within this presentation. All right, so why change management? Well, I wish I could tell you a great story about this, but the reality is the reason why Georgia Tech finally considered change management is because there was an event. And I won't bore you with all the details of it, but I'm sure you can all think of a time that you came into work one morning and something was broken and everyone wondered. First of all, they scrambled around to figure out what was going on and what happened and why it happened. And you get to the bottom of the sky is falling at your institution or your organization is because somebody in the middle of the night made a change to some system that they shouldn't have made, or they made it without considering the full risk of that change, or they made it thinking there wouldn't be any risk to it. I'm sure plenty of service desk people have heard the I didn't do anything when you know something really did do something. So that's what happened at Georgia Tech. There was an event, and the event caused a major outage on campus that it had impact for a long period of time. Now, along the same time, there was a gentleman working at Georgia Tech who was really interested in ITIL and had done the classes and done the training and saw the benefit of it and became really a champion for change management. So the combination of the event and the champion then convinced leadership that we needed to really consider this process. And honestly, up until 2018, there was no change management process at all at Georgia Tech, which is hard to believe, but it's true. And so it took some time to make that case, convince leadership, and then we had to sell everyone else on it. Now I can talk about this without any pain because I didn't work here yet. They hired me to come in and start change management. And so all of this happened before my arrival in 2018. And then when I got here, I sat down with the organization and talked about where we are and what our goals are and how change management can help us get there. And so for me, the first 6 months, even the first year, were about truly documenting, having a good process document, and building relationships. So just a little bit of background. This tells you the reason for change management. The title of this webinar is Adding Value, and I think that's what it's all about. That's what it continues to be about. It was about that before we talked about value adding in ITIL 4, but it's about showing the business or the organization that in IT, we can give you more benefit than we give you cost. And so it's all about really responding to the needs of the business, maximizing their value. And we do that through standard methods and procedures, through quickly handling changes, and through as much as we can reducing incidents and disruption to the environment. So the question I get asked every day is, what is a change then? Tell me what a change is. Well, ITIL says a change is the addition, modification, or removal of anything that can have an effect on IT services. So that's pretty much everything, right? I would say, and you'll find throughout this presentation, that at Georgia Tech, we did a little bit of interpreting on our own. So we decided in the description of change and how we would define it for the organization that anything that's a modification or removal, when we add brand new services, we do not require a change record unless those new services somehow impact something that is in production already. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. So for us, we needed to determine what was in scope and what was out of scope. And anything that's in production is in scope. Anything that's not in production, but it's used by multiple teams, or even if it's characterized as a test or development piece of equipment or a service, it's also considered in scope if it will impact another system or service. So out of scope is anything that's a single end user change. So a password change, you could make an argument, is a change, but of course we don't do change requests on every password change. That just wouldn't make any sense. I will tell you that if you have some sort of legacy system, or you have for example, a database that uses a personal username and password, if one person's username and password can infect an entire system, then you would definitely want to change requests for that. And like I said, for us, we said out of scope is service additions. So I'm going to take a breath. I don't see anything in chat, so I'm going to assume we're doing well so far. So then it's, how do you define your types of changes? Now, ITIL really said there were best practices, 3 types of changes: a normal, a standard, and an emergency. We started out with a normal, standard, and emergency, and then we found the need to step back and define an urgent change. And so for us, a normal change is something that goes through the normal flow, requires authorization of the CAB, and then is characterized based on risk. A standard change is something that requires much less documentation, much less action on the part of the requester or the implementer. And the way we define standard changes is we require 3 normal changes that are low risk and successful, and then they can ask permission to have a standard change. And what you want is to move to way more standard changes than anything else, which moves us in the right direction. And we've definitely done that over time. An urgent change for us is something that is time sensitive and needs to happen fast. So it can't meet the full time requirements as a normal change. For us, we said that there are only 4 reasons why you can have an urgent change, and you have to list those reasons in your request. It is a security issue, obviously, an audit issue for us, a business requirement. The business requires that this be done. So in the world of higher ed, if the registrar's office or the financial aid office says they've got to have this tomorrow, it's an urgent change. It has to happen tomorrow. And then finally, if we have a pending service disruption, if you see a service is about to fail or about to die, and you need to address that outside of the normal time requirements from CAB, then that's an urgent change. An emergency change is, we've got to fix something right now. We have a serious service failure, and it has to be addressed. And an emergency change can be done after the fact. So if the sky is falling chicken little, you can stop, fix the problem, and then within the next 24 hours, you put in an emergency change. Now for us, we then examine those emergency changes, because you don't want that to become a business process that everything's an emergency. So we really do assess an emergency change after the fact to make sure it really was an emergency, and see what we can learn from it going forward. All right.
Hey, Vicki.
Hey.
Hey, before you roll forward, a couple of us had the same question, so it's a good place to ask. You spoke about service additions being out of scope. Can you just speak to that quickly again, and perhaps give an example of what you mean by a service addition?
Sure, I'm so glad you asked. So a service addition would be, let's say you are setting up a brand new server in your environment, and that new server is not going to take the place of an old server. It's just a brand new server, and maybe you're adding a brand new piece of software onto that server, and that's never been used in your organization. That, in our world, is not a change. That is a brand new service, a brand new system, and it won't necessarily affect anything else. Now, having said that, if you are buying a brand new server to replace your old one, then that would be a change, because you're going to set up the new one and you're going to transfer information or data, or in some way communicate with that old server into your environment. So a replacement would be a change, but a brand new service wouldn't. Example of how that's happened here. So we began using Workday. Workday is widely used. I bet many of you use it. And the Workday implementation was a brand new service brought onto campus last year. And there was not an overall change for the Workday introduction. There was a project, the PMO office had it, and a part of that project for Workday, some pieces of it required changes. So it may be, and this is where change management, I don't talk about this in this presentation, but it's worth noting, IT change management and IT project management here at the Institute work very closely together, because there may be this big new overarching system service product that's being introduced into the environment, and changes may be required as a part of that transition, but the big project itself is not a change. Does that make sense?
I'm mulling that, and a lot of folks are coming in with but. So as an example, but doesn't that mean you're making a change to a configuration, and so you need a CMDB record, and that, you know, we talk about in ITIL that relationship between change and configuration management. And I guess there's a question, does that include cloud provisioning, like a new server in the cloud? And I guess the question I would ask is, what about the communication aspects of things? Because, you know, very often the reason why we create a change is because we need to promote awareness that something's coming and make sure everyone knows that this change is happening. You know, how are those types of things being handled?
That's a really good point.
That was a
So
lot
I
of
should back up a little bit
time,
more.
and I'm sorry.
It's okay. So that's a really good point, and I should back up and let you know that change is the first service management process that we adopted at Georgia Tech. We did not have a CMDB when we began change management. So the example you give would be a change, definitely. But for us, there was nothing to change in configuration management because we weren't doing it yet. And I know I've just shocked the world, and everyone took a big, deep breath, but that's how we did it. So I think that the point here is that it's the question that keeps happening, what's a change and what isn't. And I think if you are adopting change management in your world, that's a definition that you need to consider, and you need to be able to define what's in scope and what's out of scope for your process. And I wouldn't say there's one definite way to do it, just that you're consistent in the way you do it. Does that help?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay. I feel like you settled a little bit, but okay. All right, so let's talk about risk assessment. So I don't know how many of you have been to Atlanta, but if you've been to any major city and you walk up to a street corner and you're deciding whether or not you're going to cross the street, you make some decisions about whether or not it's okay. So if there's a walking sign and you've got the little walking person and you walk across the street, you feel like you're not really taking any risk because that walking sign gives you information about whether or not there are cars coming in whatever direction. If that walking sign is broken, then you're gonna take a different stance, right? You're gonna maybe look in both directions, maybe look at the traffic light to decide if traffic's being told to stop across the street where you're going or across the street that you're crossing. You make some assessments as to the risk. If there's not a light and you're jaywalking, you also make a decision. Is it safe for me to cross here? And some people might make decisions in different ways based on what they know to be true. So if you had a child with you that you were pulling by the hand across the street, you might not be as anxious or as willing to cross the street, to jaywalk across the street, than if you were by yourself and you were in your running shoes and it was not a rainy day. So these are all judgment calls that we make based on our own background and our perception. And risk assessment is all about that in change management. And it's really important. I think it's just one of the hinge points of change management and why it's important to assess. So For us, we characterize our normal changes into high, medium, or low risk. We determine that risk not based on how we feel or what we think or our perception. We base it on a questionnaire, a risk assessment questionnaire, because sometimes your system administrators will look at 2 lines of code change. It's not that risky. It's not a big deal. But your service desk might look at that code change and the possibility of what could happen if you do it and say, that's a little more risky. So it's important to take the blinders off, take the perception out, and really assess risk. Now for us, we have a 7-question questionnaire that produces a numerical value based on each response, and then assesses risk based on a scale. And I didn't include that in this presentation, but I would be happy to share that with you. So if you want to message me, email me, or hit me up one of the other contact ways, I'll be happy to share our risk questionnaire with you. And it has really, I mean, it has been the saving grace in a lot of ways, because unfortunately we do have those blinders on. We come at things from where we are, not from necessarily looking at the big picture. So sometimes I have to go back to people who enter change requests and say, I don't know if this risk assessment's exactly right. Can we really talk through it? And you'll find that people in your environment, and I bet you know this to be true, some people are more cautious than they have to be, and some people aren't as cautious as they should be. And so it's finding that consistency in that. And then we have to talk about cycles. And before this webinar began, Donna was asking me about our lead times and the timing of how we approve things. And so initially, when we first started this process, we were really flexible. We really just wanted people to enter changes. That's what we wanted. And so part of the maturity was realizing that risk really does matter, and we can assess that risk and communicate that risk a lot better if we have lead times in how they enter requests. So for us, we require the submission times that are listed on your screen. A low risk, we want a week's notice. A medium risk, we want 14 days notice. And a high risk, we want 45 days notice. And everyone that sees that 45 days looks at it, I know, and thinks, oh my God, that's a really long time. A month and a half. Just note that only about 2% of the changes we do are assessed as high risk. So it's really uncommon for us to do a high risk change. We usually only do a few a year, and they are major impact. They typically, a high risk change for us at Georgia Tech would be something that would impact students, faculty, staff, retirees, alumni, and researchers all over the world. So it's something that we really have to, if we're going to have to bring down a system or a service, or we're going to have to make a change that's that risky, we have to communicate it to everyone. And we have to give them enough notice to be able to push back. We have to give them enough notice to be able to make changes. Don't you love when you're doing a presentation and you see a typo? That's great. I do like the quote that says, we constantly seek to create an environment that encourages early planning and the best possible communication internally and externally. And that's from our process document. Also willing to share that with you, by the way, if you're interested. So the roles and responsibilities in change management, there's really 5 different roles, and that's the process owner, the manager, the requester, the implementer, and the CAB members. The requester and the implementer in our environment are often the same person. And the process owner and the manager were the same person for quite a while. We've since made a change there. We have 2 different people. Love this cartoon. I thought you'd do it. It is important to define those roles. We have a RACI chart that goes along with these roles that defines these roles and what their responsibilities are, so that there's no question and there's no pointing, I thought you'd do it in the end. The CAB is the keystone for us. Given a nod to ITIL 4 that the CAB starts to fade away, but it was important for us, especially in the beginning, to have this group that mitigated risk, that met once a week, and that really assessed changes. I'll tell you that our CAB now only physically meets about once a month. So we went from weekly meetings that lasted 2 hours that were intensive, but now keep in mind we had to get through all of our normal changes to be able to get to a place where they would be standards. And now we have a lot of standard changes. But we met and talked and really worked through this process, and now we don't need to do that. Most of the few changes that go to CAB now, we look at electronically, we meet remotely, and we try to have a meeting every month just to touch base, but it's not nearly the same as it was 2 years ago. Our change advisory board was made up of, or is made up of, the change manager and then a senior rep from these different areas. And you can see that we brought in not just the IT folks, but our partner IT group, some IT directors from other schools across the campus. We brought in our communications director, and just last year added the library. I don't know why we left them out to start with, but we did. And so now let's get into what the required documentation is. So for us, to start out, notice I haven't talked about the tool yet that we use, and I'm not even sure I will, but it's not about the tool. You guys know that. It's really way more about the process. And for us, the required documentation were these 6 things. We need a business justification, an implementation plan, risk and potential impact, a testing plan, a backup plan, and a communication plan. And I will tell you, when we first presented this to people, and initially when our requesters were filling out change requests, the business justification was, we got to do it. The implementation plan was, we're going to do it. The impact was none. The testing plan was, we can't test it. The backup plan was, it can't be backed out. And the communication plan would say 1 word, email. Yeah, that's it. That's all I get. So literally months and a year of asking questions and sending change requests back and trying to build relationships and talk about why this information was important. And we're in a much more robust and informative place now. We get good business justifications. I mean, ideally, your implementation plan is, if the person who's going to implement this were to be sick the day that it was supposed to be done, anyone else could step in and follow that implementation plan and make this change work without that person. Now, it's hard to get that, I'm not going to lie, because they don't want to take the time to fill it out. But there are times that it's been helpful, and it is a place to look at getting better. It is a point of continuous improvement. As far as the impact, you are doing that risk assessment, but in this section on our change request, we talk about the true verbiage of what could happen, what is the risk outside of the questionnaire. Testing plans are hard at Georgia Tech and in any public institution of higher ed. We do not always have test environments. I know that's probably shocking to some of you, but there are many times that the answer, we can't test it, is actually true. And so we have to accept that as a CAB board, only we make them explain why they can't test it and why they're comfortable without it being tested. So maybe it's something we get from a vendor, the vendors tested it. Maybe it's something that we have redundant systems so we can, we'll be safe when we make the change. And that's also true with a backup plan. Now, there are lots of developers that tell me things can't be backed out, but the reality is it can. So sometimes you just have to press them on it. And then the communication plan. And so this is an area that we had to step back into last year after we had gone a full year and say, let's define what this communication plan is. And so that means that we have to know who needs to receive the messages, what message they need to receive, when they need to receive it. And because we have an IT marketing communications person in-house, with us that sits on CAB. It lets us, we've gotten a lot better with our communication plans, and that adds value. And so then you have to report. If you don't report on it, it didn't happen. And I've seen Greg talk about how, you know, you don't just report the numbers. So I will caution you going in, don't just report we did 100 changes last week or we did 1,000 changes last month. That number is meaningless. In any good reporting, you have to make the data and the information meaningful. And so the first thing we did was to provide a forward schedule of changes, which is interesting because changes were happening and no one knew about it. Now we do a weekly forward schedule of changes. We also report every month on the number of changes that have been requested and implemented by type, risk, and team. And it's not just that number, but it's the trend of it over time. And so now that we have 2 years of data, we can really see the trends of when we're making those changes the most and when we're not doing those changes. And then we talk about deferred, canceled, and denied changes. We rarely, actually never completely deny a change in our CAB. We do ask them to make changes at time, changes to the change. We ask them to maybe move the dates. That happens a lot. Provide more detail, those kinds of things. And then we talk about emergency and unplanned changes and failed changes. Remembering in change that a failed change, well, a non-successful change is not necessarily a failure. Sometimes we have to back out the changes. Sometimes they don't work. What's important is that we gather the data and the information around that. And then we also report out our post-implementation reviews, which we do with all medium and high-risk changes and all emergency changes. So there's a review process for any of those that we gather that data and report it to senior leadership. And you know, often root cause analysis recommendations or it spins off the root cause analysis process sometimes from change management, and that comes out of post-implementation reviews. We also try to report on the number and percentage of known unauthorized changes, but I mean, I welcome any advice you guys have on how you really capture those. I mean, there are ways, and my office often finds out after the fact that things have been changed. But I mean, how do you know what you don't know? So that's constantly, I feel like that's the CSI part of my job. You know, that's where I get to do a little detective work to find out where things are happening that we don't know about. And then the number and percentages of changes that resulted in incidents. Now I have an asterisk by that because, as I said earlier, the first process we adopted was change. We didn't even have incident management when we started change, which again, I'm sure I've shocked and amazed you. But now that we have incident management, those two processes are related. You guys probably already know that. So what were our lessons learned? For us, it was very important that you have top-down adoption and support. We needed to have that leadership adoption. And as much as I love the idea of everything being about carrots, sometimes there has to be sticks. So there were people resistant, and that's where you need that leadership support. Transparency, absolutely another critical part. Always talking about it and being open about what's happening and what we're learning and where we're going. And I think you really need a champion. You need somebody that's going to be able to give that elevator speech over and over about why change is important and why it's needed in your institution or your organization. Definitely clear, concise communication. Like I said, we added an IT marketing and communications person here at Georgia Tech, and that has been a critical role for us, and it's really helped us in making sure that we're getting the messages out there. Need to get proper training regardless of which tool you use. You do need to understand how that tool works and make sure that it's working properly for you. And you need folks that are trained, and ITSM Academy would be a great place to start for that. That plug was free, by the way. And then you need to make sure that you're focusing on the process and not the tool. Change is hard, y'all. You know, there are people that say they like change, and what I find is that most people that even say they like change don't. They just like for other people to change. So you have to recognize that change in any, I mean, if you're taking on a new process, it's hard. If you're taking on change management, it's really hard. And then making sure that continuous improvement is an ongoing process from the beginning. We say that our change process document is a living document. I mean, I actually started a draft of a new version yesterday because someone from senior leadership came and said, you know, I think we probably need to tweak this. So let's talk about it. Now, the version that we have now has been in place about 8 or 9 months. So it's not something we change every day, but you constantly need to look back at the process, see what's working for you and what isn't. And then reporting is critical. Don't do anything in a vacuum. Make sure you're sharing what you're doing and how it's working and how it's going. So just to conclude and leave time for questions, we really saw benefit in the first year. And I can tell you now that we're 2 years in, we've seen even more benefit. And starting in January of this year, it presented a new opportunity for how can we continue to improve this, especially as we've added these other processes. So we saw definite improved alignment in services, definitely better perception of IT as a whole, especially our sister units and our distributed IT. I brought them into the communication channels, and they're very happy to now know when things are going to happen and how it will impact them. We definitely improved our risk assessment and any adverse impact of changes. And we like to say we increased productivity of users with less disruption. Of course, I can't quantify that, but it's something to work toward. And then reduce the number of urgent and emergency changes. Our number of standard changes far outnumber any of the other types now, and that's the model that you're going toward. That's what you want to see. And so when you think about if you were in a version 3 environment and you're thinking about moving to 4, ITIL 4 gives you a continual improvement model, and that's these 7 questions. And that's something that we are internally asking ourselves every month, but definitely at the start of a new year. And how can we get better? And how can we definitely provide more value?